In the gilded cage of a Manhattan penthouse ballroom, soundproofed against the city's conscience, 19-year-old Eleanor stood on a small elevated platform. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey and moral rot, a suffocating perfume for the city's most ruthless predators. She was Lot 7, a human commodity presented under the warm, cruel glow of a crystal chandelier. Her innocence, snatched from a rain-slicked street just hours before, was now the prize in a silent, savage auction. Fear was a vice around her ribs, but behind it a defiant fire burned in her gaze, a silent, furious testament to the soul they could not touch, a challenge thrown into the faces of monsters who traded in human lives as easily as they traded stocks. But what happened in that soundproofed room would ignite a war in the city's underworld. And if you watch until the very end, you will understand how a single look can be more powerful than a declaration of war. Subscribe to our channel now and let us know in the comments where you are watching this story unfold from. We want to hear from you as you witness the moment a monster chose to become a savior, challenging the very foundations of his dark empire for a woman he had never met, a woman who would become his only weakness and his last chance at redemption. Eleanor was a name whispered only to herself now, a relic of a life that felt a lifetime away. She had been a student, a girl who found solace in the quiet solitude of libraries and the anonymous comfort of a crowded city. She carried the weight of a past marked by loss, a quiet grief that had forged in her an unyielding sense of justice and a fierce independence. This silent strength was all she had left. She was not a fighter in the physical sense. Her resilience was a quiet, internal rebellion. She refused to let them see her break, holding on to the dignity of her own mind as they bartered for her body, a lone flickering candle in an abyss of profound darkness. The environment itself was an accomplice to the crime. The deep crimson of the velvet curtains absorbed all sound, creating a vacuum where only the auctioneer's smooth, predatory voice could echo. Reflections of the bidders, faceless men in tailored suits, distorted across the polished marble floor, turning them into monstrous silhouettes of greed and power. The rhythmic clinking of ice in glasses was a metronome counting down the seconds of her freedom. This opulent prison was a world away from her own, yet the feeling of being trapped was horribly familiar. A suffocating echo of the financial and emotional walls that had always seemed to close in on her. But now they had a face and a price. This profound sense of injustice was not new to her. She had been fighting silent battles her whole life, ever since losing the only family she had ever known in an accident that felt like a cruel cosmic joke. That loss had taught her that the world was not a fair place, that innocence was a fragile shield against the brutalities of fate. It was this ingrained understanding that now fueled her defiance. She watched the men bidding on her life, not just with fear, but with a deep, searing contempt. They were not just buying a person, they were mocking the very idea of human worth. And in her silent gaze she judged every single one of them, her spirit refusing to be cowed. As the auctioneer's voice rose, announcing the final offers, the numbers became a meaningless drone. A cold dread washed over Eleanor, the chilling realization that her fate was about to be sealed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She could feel the collective gaze of the room, a physical weight pressing down on her, stripping her of her identity until she was nothing more than an object of desire. The men were no longer individuals, but a single, many-headed beast, its appetite insatiable. In that moment, the loneliness was absolute, a cold, sharp point piercing through the chaos, and she closed her eyes, bracing for the fall. The gavel was raised, a wooden specter poised to shatter her world. The room held its breath, a collective pause in anticipation of the final, damning strike. But it never came. Instead, a new kind of silence descended, a stillness so absolute and heavy that it felt more threatening than any sound. It originated from a dark corner of the room, a void in the sea of shadows. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, drawn to the source of this sudden shift in power. A single gaze met hers across the expanse. It was not hungry or lecherous. It was cold, analytical, and held a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Yet in its depths she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. Before the auction, before the soundproofed room and the soulless bids, Eleanor's world was a muted palette of gray, a relentless cycle dictated by the screech of the Q train and the indifferent ticking of a greasy spoon's clock. Her life unfolded in the boroughs, a universe away from the glittering spires of Manhattan she could only glimpse from a distance. Each morning began in the pre-dawn chill, pulling on a starched, ill-fitting waitress uniform that felt more like a costume of submission than a work garment. It smelled of bleach and fryer oil, a constant reminder of her place. The crowded bus was her daily purgatory, a press of weary bodies swaying in unison. Each passenger lost in their own quiet struggle, their faces illuminated by the fleeting glow of their phones. Her days were spent at the Silver Bell Diner, a relic of a bygone era, where the coffee was perpetually burnt and the owner, a man named Henderson, ruled with a cheap tyrant's authority. The air was a thick concoction of stale cigarette smoke clinging to the vinyl booths and the sharp, cloying scent of industrial cleaning supplies. Eleanor moved through this space with a practiced, silent grace, her movements economical and precise. She refilled coffee cups, wiped down sticky counters, and balanced heavy trays, all while maintaining a polite, vacant smile. It was a performance of endurance, a daily battle to keep the exhaustion from her eyes and the defiance from her posture, a quiet war waged on a linoleum battlefield. Henderson was a man whose power was derived from the smallness of others' lives. He patrolled the diner floor with a proprietary air, his gaze a constant, invasive presence. He found fault in everything she did: a crumb left on a table, a coffee refilled too slowly, a smile that didn't seem genuine enough. His corrections were never instructive, always demeaning, delivered in a low voice meant only for her, a small, cruel pleasure he took in reminding her of her dependency. Eleanor learned to absorb these daily humiliations, turning them into fuel. She would meet his gaze with a steady, unreadable calm, a silent refusal to grant him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her dignity was her shield, and it infuriated him. The walls of her small apartment in Queens were thin, but the weight of the letters on her kitchen table felt heavier than concrete. They were final notices, their red-inked warnings a constant throbbing ache in the back of her mind. The debt was not hers, not really. It was the ghost of her mother's long, painful illness, a mountain of medical bills left behind as a final, cruel inheritance. Eleanor worked double shifts not for a future, but to keep this past from swallowing her whole. Every dollar she earned was already spent, every hour of her life mortgaged to a hospital she could no longer even picture. This financial prison was inescapable, its bars forged from love and loss. In rare, stolen moments, she would stand by the diner's grimy back window, which offered a sliver of a view of the East River and the distant, shimmering skyline of Manhattan. She would watch the ferries glide across the water and imagine the lives of the people in those glass towers, lives of choice, of freedom, of consequence. It wasn't a world she envied with bitterness, but one she observed with a quiet, aching curiosity. It was a reminder that another reality existed, a world where a person was more than their uniform or their debt. These moments of silent dreaming were her only escape, a private rebellion of the mind against the tyranny of her circumstances. Her solitude was profound, a state of being she had inhabited since the accident that took her parents years ago. She had no siblings, no extended family to call upon. This isolation had forged in her a fierce self-reliance, but it also made her achingly vulnerable. There was no safety net, no one to notice if she faltered or disappeared. Her moral compass was her only inheritance, a set of principles instilled by a father who taught her kindness and a mother who showed her strength. She clung to these lessons as a castaway, navigating the murky waters of her life with an integrity that the world seemed determined to punish. This innate sense of justice manifested in small, almost invisible acts. She would slip an extra bread roll to the elderly man who came in every day for a single cup of coffee, or speak a gentle word to a frantic young mother whose child was crying. These were gestures that cost her, earning her sharp reprimands from Henderson. But she couldn't stop. To do so would be to extinguish the last flicker of her true self. It was her way of asserting that even in a world built on transactions and power dynamics, empathy still had value. It was a quiet insistence that a person's worth was not measured by what they had, but by what they were willing to give. The exhaustion was more than physical. It was a deep soul-level weariness. At the end of each 16-hour day, her feet would ache, her back would burn, and her smile would feel like a brittle mask she could finally let crumble. The walk from the bus stop to her apartment was always the hardest part. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, and every passing car, every footstep behind her, sent a jolt of primal fear through her system. She walked with her keys clutched in her fist, a small metal weapon against a world that felt increasingly predatory. She was constantly aware of how alone she was, a single, small light in a vast and indifferent darkness. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the empty diner. Henderson blocked her exit, a leering smile on his face. He told her she was short on the day's earnings, and that there was a way she could make it up to him. The proposition hung in the air, thick and vile. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, outlining a future of continued employment in exchange for her submission. He saw her not as a person but as a cornered animal, and he was ready to pounce. It was the culmination of every small indignity, every casual cruelty, every moment she had been made to feel powerless. For the first time, Eleanor did not respond with silence. A single word escaped her lips, quiet but absolute. No. It was not a plea or a negotiation, it was a declaration. The shock on Henderson's face was quickly replaced by a dark, simmering rage. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, and shoved her toward the door. He told her she was fired, that she was nothing, and that she would find out soon enough what the world did to girls like her who had no one. He threw her final meager pay onto the rain-slicked pavement. As she walked away into the cold, unforgiving night, she was free of him, but she had never been more vulnerable. From a dark alcove, shielded by the room's opulent shadows, a figure emerged. He was not part of the frenzied bidding, not a participant in the grotesque theater of wealth. Declan Callahan moved with a stillness that commanded more attention than any shout. He was a specter in a bespoke charcoal suit, his presence a sudden drop in temperature, a void that pulled all light and sound into itself. The men around him, titans of industry and crime, instinctively shrank back, their boisterous confidence evaporating into a reverent, fearful silence. His power was not announced, it was an undeniable law of physics in this room, a quiet gravitational force that bent the world to his will without a single word. His face was a study in controlled severity, carved from hard lines and discipline. There were no tells, no wasted expressions, only an unnerving calm that suggested a mind constantly assessing every threat, every angle.
His dark hair was meticulously styled, but a single faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a stark white line against his skin, the only visible imperfection, a silent testament to a violence he had survived and mastered. His eyes, the color of a storm-darkened sea, were his most formidable feature. They were not cruel, but they were devoid of sentiment. They saw everything, judged everything, and forgave nothing. They were the eyes of a man who had buried his own soul long ago. Eleanor felt his gaze before she saw it. It was entirely different from the leering, possessive looks she had endured all night. This was not the look of a buyer examining merchandise. It was sharp, analytical, and piercing, as if he were looking past her fear, past her skin, and directly into the core of her defiance. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, she felt seen. Not as a body to be owned, but as a will that refused to be broken. The other men saw a victim. He, she realized with a jolt of primal intuition, saw a survivor. And in that recognition, there was a danger more profound than any she had yet faced in this gilded cage. He rose from his chair, a slow, deliberate motion that brought the entire room to a standstill. The auctioneer's practiced predatory smile faltered, his words dying in his throat. The gavel, which had been poised to fall and shatter her life, remained frozen in mid-air. A silence descended, so absolute and heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on them all. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated fear, a deference to a power that needed no introduction. Declan Callahan did not command the room, he owned it. And everyone in it was merely a tenant living on his terms, their leases subject to immediate, violent termination. His gaze left Eleanor and settled on the auctioneer. It was a look of profound, chilling disappointment. The kind a king might give a courtier who had committed an unforgivable treason. There was no anger, no overt threat, just a cold, silent judgment that promised consequences far worse than a simple death. The auctioneer, a man who trafficked in human misery with a casual smile, visibly paled. His composure, his authority, it all dissolved under the weight of that single, unwavering stare. He was no longer a predator, he was prey. And he had just realized the apex hunter had entered his territory, uninvited and deeply displeased. Then those storm-gray eyes returned to her. The intensity of his focus was a physical force, pinning her in place. In their depths, she saw not a monster, but something far more complex. A profound weariness, a flicker of something that looked like honor, twisted and scarred, but not yet extinguished. He saw her, not the symbol of innocence the bidders craved, but the raw, unvarnished truth of her spirit. He saw the fire she had so carefully guarded, the silent fury at the injustice of it all. In that shared gaze, a silent and impossible connection was forged, a bridge of understanding across an abyss of violence and despair. He began to walk toward the platform. His steps were measured, unhurried, yet each one echoed in the cavernous silence like a drumbeat counting down to a final judgment. The crowd of powerful men parted before him, a silent, fearful wave receding from an unstoppable tide. He moved through them as if they were ghosts, his focus singular, locked entirely on her. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it a strange, terrifying flicker of hope ignited, a feeling so foreign and dangerous she tried to smother it immediately.
He stopped just before the elevated stage, standing on the marble floor below. This simple act changed the dynamic completely. He was not looking up at her as an object of acquisition. He was looking directly at her, eye to eye, as an equal. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke. His voice was low, a quiet baritone with a subtle rasp, yet it carried across the silent room with the finality of a death sentence. It was not a shout, but a declaration. The auction is over. The words were simple, but they were an edict, a rewriting of reality itself. A collective silent gasp rippled through the audience. He paid them no mind. His eyes remained on Eleanor, holding her captive in their depths. He was speaking to the room, but the message felt intensely personal, aimed directly at her. He gave a final, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of grim resolution. Then he delivered the final blow to this corrupt world, a sentence that would ignite a war in the city's underworld. She is not for sale. The words hung in the air, a shield and a promise, a condemnation, a claim, all at once. For Eleanor, they were the sound of one cage being broken, only to be replaced by another. He turned his back on her then, a dismissal as absolute as his arrival. He walked toward the grand doors without a backward glance, his discreet security detail melting out of the shadows to flank him. The spell was broken. A cacophony of panicked whispers erupted in his wake, but the fear he left behind was a palpable entity, a toxic fog that choked the room's decadent air. He was gone, but his presence remained, an indelible brand on the silence. Eleanor stood alone on the platform, no longer Lot 7, but a symbol of a broken rule, the unwilling catalyst for a war she could not comprehend, saved by a ghost who was more dangerous than all the monsters combined. The silence of the penthouse apartment was a different kind of prison. It was vast, sterile, and wrapped in the scent of lemon oil and old money. Eleanor was no longer a lot number, but she was still a possession, a fragile piece of art moved to a more secure vault. She spent her first days in a state of suspended disbelief, wandering through rooms of polished marble and cold minimalist furniture. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's eye view of a city that was no longer hers to walk. She was safe, she was fed, she was clothed in silks she never asked for, but she was a ghost in a gilded cage, her life held in the palm of a man whose name she still didn't know, a man who had bought her with 2 simple sentences. He came on the 3rd day, appearing in the living room as if summoned from the shadows themselves. There was no sound, no warning. One moment she was staring at the indifferent skyline, the next he was there, a dark, motionless figure by the doorway. He didn't speak, he only watched, his storm-gray eyes assessing her as she stood frozen in the center of the room. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her numbness. This was her savior, her captor. He was the reason she was alive, and the reason she had no life. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and unreadable intentions, a battlefield where the only weapons were their gazes, and she refused to be the first to look away. His presence was a constant, even in his absence. She would find things left for her, small, impossibly personal gestures that were more unnerving than any threat. A first edition of a novel she'd once mentioned loving in a casual conversation, overheard by one of his men. A single, perfect gardenia, her mother's favorite flower, placed in a crystal vase on the nightstand. These were not gifts, they were statements. He was learning her, deconstructing her past, her tastes, her soul, all without her permission. Each object was a reminder that she was being observed, that every corner of her life, past and present, was now subject to his silent, invasive scrutiny, a violation that felt both terrifying and strangely intimate. She began to push back in small, silent ways. She left the expensive food untouched, preferring the simple bread and cheese she requested from the silent woman who brought her meals. She ignored the designer clothes laid out for her, continuing to wear the simple dress she had been given after the auction. She piled the rare books neatly in a corner, unread. These were petty rebellions, the only acts of defiance available to her. She needed to assert that while he controlled her physical world, her mind, her will, remained her own.
It was a dangerous game, testing the limits of a man whose limits were unknown, but it was the only way she could remember who she was before she became his protected prisoner. One evening, she found him in the apartment's private library, a room she had avoided until now. He was not reading, but simply standing before a wall of leather-bound books, his back to her. He seemed different here, surrounded by the quiet weight of stories, almost a part of the room's deep, somber stillness. He must have sensed her presence, for he turned slowly, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You are not comfortable," he stated, his voice a low murmur that seemed to soak into the wood-paneled walls. It was not a question, it was a fact he had observed, an equation he had solved. He saw her defiance for what it was, a shield. And for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than control in his eyes. "Comfort is a privilege," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the sheer force of his presence. "It's not something I expect." The words hung in the air, a quiet accusation and a stark reminder of the chasm between their worlds. He lived in a world of absolute comfort built on the discomfort of others. She lived in a world where survival was the only goal. His gaze intensified, a flicker of surprise, or perhaps respect, in their depths. He was used to fear, to obedience, to greed. He was not used to a quiet, unyielding morality that judged him without saying a word, and it visibly unsettled him. He took a step closer, and the space between them crackled with a tension that was almost physical. He stopped just an arm's length away, close enough for her to see the fine lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the faint, silvering strands of hair at his temples. He was not just a myth, a ghost of the underworld. He was a man, one who carried an immense, soul-crushing weight. "What is it you do expect, Eleanor?" he asked, the sound of her name from his lips both a violation and a strange validation. It was the first time anyone had called her by her name in what felt like an eternity. He was asking about her expectations, but the real question was about her price, and he was beginning to realize she didn't have one. She didn't answer immediately, letting the silence press in on them. The scent of old paper and leather filled her lungs, a scent she had always associated with safety, now charged with danger. "I expect nothing from you," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper but sharp as glass. "You took me from one cage and put me in another. The view is better, but the bars are the same." A muscle tightened in his jaw, the only sign that her words had hit their mark. He had saved her life, but he had also stolen it, and her quiet, unwavering honesty forced him to confront a truth he preferred to keep buried beneath layers of power and control. He was not a savior. This became their new reality, a series of charged, silent encounters in the gilded prison of his home. He would appear without warning, and they would exist in the same space, locked in a battle of wills that was fought with lingering glances and loaded silences. She would read by the window, acutely aware of him watching her from the doorway. He would sit in a darkened corner of the room while she ate, his presence a heavy cloak over the sterile atmosphere. She began to see the man behind the monster, the profound loneliness in his stillness, the deep, abiding guilt that shadowed his eyes. He was a king in a kingdom of ashes, and he was utterly alone. He, in turn, was undone by her. Her quiet resilience was a rebuke to his entire existence. She possessed an integrity he had long ago traded for power. He saw the empathy in her when she spoke kindly to the staff, the courage in her when she met his gaze without flinching. She was a relic of a world he no longer believed in, a world where honor was not about violence and loyalty, but about kindness and truth. He had intended to keep her safe and hidden, a debt paid to a code he barely followed anymore. But she was not a passive object to be protected. She was a mirror, and in her reflection he saw the man he might have been and the monster he had become. The tension between them was a taut wire, humming with a dangerous energy. One afternoon, as she reached for a glass of water, her hand brushed against his as he reached for the same pitcher. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through both of them. His skin was cold, a stark contrast to the sudden heat that flooded her veins. They pulled back at the same instant, their eyes locking in a moment of shared shock. It was the first time they had touched, and the brief connection was more potent than any word, a silent acknowledgment of the powerful, forbidden current flowing just beneath the surface of their silent war. He began to let her out, always with two of his silent, ever-present guards. They would take her to a private art gallery after hours, or a secluded park overlooking the Hudson. These were not acts of kindness, but calculated tests. He wanted to see how she would react to glimpses of her old world. He watched her from a distance, a dark figure in a town car parked across the street. He saw the longing in her eyes as she watched families laughing, the sadness as she looked at a piece of art that moved her. He was studying her capacity for hope, perhaps to see if it was something that could be extinguished, or perhaps to see if he could learn from it. She knew she was being watched. She could feel his gaze on her like a physical touch, even from a block away. It was no longer just fear she felt, but a complex, terrifying mixture of resentment and a strange nascent dependency. He was the source of her confinement and her only shield against a world that had tried to consume her. She hated him for the power he held over her, for the life he had taken. But a small, traitorous part of her felt a flicker of something else when his car would pull away. A sense of loss, a recognition that his dark, watchful presence was the only thing standing between her and an abyss. Her internal conflict was a constant, raging storm.
Her mind screamed that he was a murderer, a criminal, a man who dealt in death and fear. Her moral compass, the very core of her being, told her to run, to fight, to reject everything he represented. But her heart, a foolish, treacherous thing, saw something else. It saw the man who had stopped an entire room of monsters with a single look. It saw the flicker of pain in his eyes when she spoke of her past. It saw a soul as trapped as her own, albeit in a prison of his own making. Fear and fascination were locked in a deadly dance within her, and she was losing control. Declan, too, was fighting a losing battle. He had built an empire on emotional detachment. Feelings were liabilities, connections were weaknesses to be exploited. Yet this girl, with her quiet defiance and unbroken spirit, was dismantling his defenses one silent glance at a time. He found himself rearranging his schedule to be in the penthouse when she was there. He craved the unsettling peace of her presence, the way her quiet integrity seemed to momentarily cleanse the filth from his own soul. Protecting her had started as a matter of principle, a line he would not allow his world to cross. Now it was becoming an obsession, his last desperate attempt at redemption. The breaking point came during a walk through a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood he had deemed safe. A black sedan, not one of his, had been following them for 3 blocks. Eleanor noticed the subtle shift in her guard's posture, the way their hands drifted toward the inside of their jackets. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. The car suddenly accelerated, swerving toward the curb, its tires screeching on the pavement. It was a clear, unambiguous threat, a message sent directly from the world he commanded. The war he had started that night at the auction had finally come for her. Before her guards could react, another car, Declan's car, materialized from a side street, cutting off the sedan with a violent screech of metal on metal. He was out of the driver's side in an instant, moving with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold. He did not go for the other driver.
Instead, he came directly to her, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard but not painful, and pulled her behind him, shielding her with his own body. "Get in the car," he ordered, his voice a low, deadly growl. In that moment, as chaos erupted around them, the line between her captor and her protector vanished completely, leaving only a terrifying, undeniable bond. The car door slammed shut, a sound as final as a prison gate, sealing them inside the sterile silence of the vehicle. Outside, the world devolved into a symphony of chaos, the angry blare of a horn, the distant wail of approaching sirens, and a single sharp shout swallowed by the city's roar. Declan was a blur of lethal efficiency, his movements precise and devoid of panic as he navigated the car through a labyrinth of back alleys, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. Eleanor was pressed back into the supple leather of the seat, her body trembling not from the cold, but from the violent adrenaline coursing through her veins. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the rain and the faint, clean fragrance of his cologne, a jarringly civilized aroma in the midst of such raw, primal danger. He drove with a focused fury, the city lights smearing into streaks of neon and white across the rain-beaded windows. They were a ghost moving through the city's arteries, unseen and untouchable. This was his element, she realized with a chilling certainty. The chaos, the threat, the silent deadly dance of predator and prey, he commanded it with the same unnerving stillness he commanded a room. She watched his hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles white but his grip steady. He was not just a man who orders violence, he was a man who was intimately familiar with its every texture and rhythm. The protection he offered was not a shield, it was a different, more dangerous kind of sword, and she was now inextricably tied to its bloody hilt. As the immediate danger receded, replaced by the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, a new kind of terror began to bloom in her chest. It was cold, clear, and sharp. This was her life now, running, hiding, a perpetual target in a war she never asked to be a part of. The gilded cage of the penthouse had been a lie, a beautiful facade, hiding the brutal truth that she was not safe, merely isolated. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a savior or a captor, but as the architect of this new, terrifying reality. The controlled calm on his face was no longer a sign of strength, but a mask for the profound violence that defined his existence, a violence that had now spilled over and stained her own. The silence in the car became unbearable, a vacuum that her own voice rushed to fill, breaking her long-held rule of quiet endurance. "Is this what your protection looks like?" The words were quiet, but they cracked like a whip in the confined space. Her voice, laced with a tremor she could not control, rose with a righteous fury. "Being hunted on the street, living in a tower waiting for the next car to try and run me down? You didn't save me."
You just made me a more valuable prize in your sick, violent game. She was no longer afraid of him, only of what he had turned her into, a pawn, a symbol, a perpetual victim in a world where her life was measured only by its value to men like him. He didn't answer. Instead, he wrenched the wheel, pulling the car into a dark, deserted industrial laneway, the brick walls on either side closing in like a trap. He killed the engine. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain drumming on the car's roof. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield, his jaw a hard, tight line of granite. Her accusation hung between them, a living, breathing thing, and his stillness was not a dismissal, but an absorption of the blow. He had built an empire on control, and she, with a few simple, honest words, had just shown him the one thing he could not command, her safety. Slowly, as if moving against an immense physical weight, he turned to face her. The mask was gone. In the dim, ambient light from the street, his eyes were not cold or stormy. They were burning with a raw, agonizing torment that stole her breath. It was a fury directed not at her, but inward, at himself. "Yes," he finally said, his voice a low, ragged sound, stripped of all its authority. "This is what it looks like. Because there is no place in my world for you to be safe. There is no wall high enough. I took you out of that room to stop them from owning you, and in doing so, I put a target on your soul that will never fade." It was a confession, a testament to his ultimate, catastrophic failure. Then he moved. He closed the small distance between them in an instant, a desperate, fluid motion that was not about power, but about a profound, soul-deep need. His hand came up, not in anger, but with a trembling urgency. He didn't touch her lips or her body. Instead, his fingers tangled gently in the hair at the nape of her neck, his palm cupping the back of her head with a reverence that felt like a prayer. He pulled her forward, not into a kiss, but until their foreheads rested against each other. It was a gesture of utter surrender, of shared pain, a silent, desperate plea for an absolution he would never find. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, every nerve ending alive with the shock of his touch. She could feel the faint tremor in his hand, the warmth of his skin, the soft, unsteady puff of his breath against her cheek. This was not the touch of a monster or a king. It was the touch of a man breaking apart. She could feel the immense, crushing weight of his guilt, the years of violence and loss, all converging in this one sacred, terrifying moment of contact. She didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, and for a single, infinite second, she was no longer his prisoner, and he was no longer her captor. They were just two broken souls, holding each other up in the dark. He was the one to break the contact, pulling back as if burned. He retreated to his side of the car, the invisible wall between them rebuilt, but it was now made of glass, and they had both seen the truth on the other side. He looked away from her, staring out at the rain-slicked brick, but she could see the profound shame and vulnerability in the line of his shoulders. He had broken the most fundamental rule of his existence. He had let her in. He had shown her the man behind the ghost, and the exposure had left him raw, defenseless, and irrevocably changed. He had protected her with his body, but he had just laid his soul bare. He started the car, the engine's rumble a profane intrusion on the hollowed silence. He pulled out of the alley and drove back into the city's indifferent glow. But everything was different. The silence that filled the car was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a shared space, heavy with the weight of an unspoken confession. He had crossed a line for her, breaking his own code of detachment. And she had seen the devastating cost. They drove without speaking, the city lights washing over them, two separate beings now bound by a single, dangerous truth. His last remaining piece of humanity now resided in her, and they were both in mortal danger because of it. The drive back to the penthouse was a journey through a muted, underwater world. The city's vibrant lights were fractured into a million weeping colors by the rain on the windows, a distorted reflection of the chaos that had just unfolded. The silence that now filled the car was a fragile, wounded thing, entirely different from the weaponized stillness they had shared before. It was heavy with the weight of his confession,
the ghost of his touch on her skin, and the terrifying, unspoken truth that had been laid bare between them in that dark alley. He had crossed a line, not just with his enemies, but within himself. He had allowed a vulnerability to surface, and now, in the sterile quiet of the luxury car, they both felt the immense, terrifying gravity of its consequence, a shared secret that isolated them together. He escorted her to the penthouse door, the journey up in the private elevator a slow, agonizing ascent into their separate realities. He didn't follow her inside. He simply stood in the doorway, a sentinel cloaked in shadows, his face an unreadable mask once more, but his eyes, for a fleeting second, held the same raw torment she had seen in the car.
There were no words of comfort, no promises of safety. There was only a look, a final, lingering gaze that was both a farewell and a warning. It was the look of a man caging a beast within himself, a man preparing to descend into a darkness he could not allow her to follow. Then he stepped back, and the heavy door clicked shut between them, the sound echoing in the cavernous foyer like the final, definitive closing of a tomb. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of her gilded imprisonment, transformed into a vast, echoing mausoleo of his absence. The profound silence was no longer a reprieve, but a palpable entity, a suffocating void where the tension of his presence had once been. Her own footsteps on the cold marble floors sounded unnervingly loud, a lonely rhythm in a world that had gone completely still. She would wander through the immaculate rooms, tracing the lines of furniture he had sat on, her fingers hovering over objects he might have touched. The silence was a constant reminder of the chaos he had re-entered on her behalf, and the loneliness was sharper now, for she was no longer just alone. She was left behind, a ghost in a fortress built to protect a life that no longer felt like her own. Days bled into a gray, featureless week. Her constant companion was the window, a pane of glass separating her from a world she could see but not rejoin. She would stand for hours, watching the rain wash over the city, each drop a tiny distortion, blurring the sharp edges of the skyscrapers into a melancholic watercolor painting. The city was a living, breathing thing down below, its traffic a silent, flowing river of lights. But up here she was suspended in time, a spectator to a life she used to live. The window was a perfect metaphor for her existence. It offered a view of freedom while serving as an unbreachable barrier, a constant, cruel reminder of the distance he had placed between them, a distance measured not in miles, but in blood and secrets. While she lived in sterile silence, he descended back into the cacophony of his world. Declan Callahan became the ghost once more, a wraith moving through the city's criminal underworld with renewed, ruthless purpose. His life became a blur of hushed, late-night meetings in smoke-filled back rooms, of cryptic phone calls and whispered orders that resulted in violence on distant streets. He was cauterizing a wound, systematically eliminating every threat, every loose end, every person who knew of her existence. Each move he made pushed him deeper into the moral abyss, forcing him to become more of the monster she had seen past. It was a brutal, bloody penance, the only way he knew how to honor the moment of humanity she had shown him was by burying his own completely. The initial sting of abandonment in Eleanor's heart slowly, painfully, began to transform into a sharp, piercing lucidity. The fear and resentment gave way to a devastating understanding. He had not pushed her away out of cruelty or indifference. He had severed their connection as a surgeon might amputate a limb to save a life.
His withdrawal was not an act of rejection, but an act of profound, desperate protection. He was drawing all the fire, all the danger, onto himself, making himself the sole target so she could remain invisible. This realization was a heavier burden than the fear had ever been. It meant she was not his victim, but his purpose, and the weight of that violent, selfless sacrifice settled deep within her soul, maturing her grief into a quiet, resilient strength. His presence lingered even in his absolute physical absence. The security detail around the building became more discreet, almost invisible, yet she could feel their watchfulness, a silent, protective net cast from a great distance. Sometimes a new book would appear on the coffee table, one she had never mentioned, but which spoke to a feeling she was grappling with, a silent, impossible communication across the void. These were not gifts, but echoes of his omniscience, proof that even from the depths of his war, his focus remained on her. She was the safest, most isolated person in the entire city, a precious secret kept by a man who was methodically destroying his own world and parts of himself to ensure hers remain intact and untouched. Time itself became a form of quiet torture, its passage marked only by the sun rising and setting over the indifferent skyline. The grand clock in the living room, with its elegant sweeping hands, became an object of her obsession. Each tick was a second he was out there, in the violent world she could only imagine. Each tuck was a second closer to a future she could not envision. Days turned to weeks, and the silence stretched, becoming a permanent feature of her existence. The lack of any word from him was absolute. It was a silence born of necessity, a testament to the gravity of the danger she was in. He could not risk contact, and she understood that this profound quiet was the loudest, most definitive proof of his protection. One evening, while aimlessly flipping through television channels, she stumbled upon a local news report. The anchor spoke in grave tones about a sudden, brutal escalation in the city's gang violence, mentioning a power vacuum in the underworld and the fall of several prominent criminal figures. The names were foreign to her, the locations just spots on a map, but she felt a cold dread seep into her bones.
She knew, with an instinct that went deeper than logic, that this was his work. This was the war he had started for her, and she was watching its casualties being counted on the evening news. The abstract violence of his world became terrifyingly real, and she felt the moral weight of the blood being shed in her name, a silent accomplice to a war she never wanted. She turned off the television, plunging the room back into its familiar darkness and silence. She walked to the window, the city lights below now seeming less like jewels and more like the embers of 1,000 distant fires. The chasm between them felt infinite now, a gulf carved not only by his dangerous life, but by the brutal choices he had made to keep her separate from it. Her pain had become a quiet, knowing sorrow. She no longer waited for his return. She understood that his absence was the ultimate, final testament to what she had glimpsed in him. The echo of what they had shared in the car, that single moment of raw connection, was now all that was left, a silent, unbreakable bond defined by the very distance that was tearing them apart. 6 months passed, each one a silent gray stone dropped into the well of time. The penthouse was a distant memory, a dream of marble and glass. Declan had orchestrated her disappearance with the same ruthless efficiency with which he ran his empire. He had given her a new name, a clean slate, and a quiet life in a city far from the ghosts of Manhattan. She was a student now, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the earnest chatter of young minds discussing philosophy and art. She was building a life of normalcy, piece by painstaking piece. But a part of her remained in that soundproofed room, in that dark alley,
forever tethered to the man who had both broken her world and saved her soul. The quiet was what she had always craved, yet now it felt incomplete, a silence that no longer held the dangerous, comforting weight of his presence. One crisp autumn afternoon, she found herself in the hushed sanctuary of the university's main library, a place that felt like a return to a former self. The late sun slanted through the tall arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden spirits. She ran her fingers over the spine of a leather-bound book, the familiar texture a balm to a wound she couldn't name. It was then that she felt it, the ghost of a sensation, a prickling on the back of her neck that was both deeply familiar and utterly impossible. It was the feeling of being watched, not with malice or threat, but with a profound, unwavering focus. She scanned the crowded reading room, but saw only students lost in their books. The feeling was a memory, she told herself, an echo of a past that still clung to her like a shadow. As she stepped out of the library's grand stone entrance, pulling her scarf tighter against the evening chill, she saw it. Across the street, partially obscured by the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree, was a black town car. It was sleek, anonymous, and utterly still. The windows were tinted to an impenetrable darkness, reflecting the fiery colors of the sunset. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful hitch in her chest. There was no proof, no logic, only a certainty that resonated deep in her bones. He was in there. He had found her, not to reclaim her, but to see. To ensure that the world he had bled for, the peace he had bought for her at such a high cost, was real. He was a ghost, keeping a silent, solitary vigil over his last act of redemption. She did not run. She did not hide. She simply stood on the library steps, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face, and looked directly at the car. The distance between them was a universe, filled with the noise of passing traffic, the chatter of students, and the unbridgeable chasm of their two worlds. Yet in that shared, silent gaze, 1,000 words were spoken. It was an acknowledgment of the debt, a recognition of the sacrifice, and a quiet, mutual absolution. He was the guardian at the gate of her new life, a dark angel, ensuring no part of his world would ever touch hers again. She saw not a captor, but the keeper of a violent promise, and in his unseen presence, she finally understood the true meaning of being free. A small, sad smile touched her lips, a gesture of profound and heartbreaking gratitude. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a release, a farewell, a final acceptance of the path he had chosen for them both. Then she turned her back on the car, on the ghost, on the life that couldn't be, and walked down the steps. She did not look back. She walked toward the setting sun, her shadow long behind her, each step sure and steady, carrying with her the quiet strength he had shown her she possessed. The town car remained motionless for a long time, a dark slash against the vibrant twilight, before it finally, silently, pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the approaching night, leaving her to the light. He had given her back her life, and in doing so, she had given him back a reason to have a soul. Theirs was not a story that would end in an embrace, but in the quiet, aching beauty of two worlds that touched for a moment, and then, for the sake of survival, pulled apart forever. His redemption was not in being with her, but in his choice to let her go, to remain her silent protector from a distance she would never have to cross again. A small, sad smile touched her lips, a gesture of profound and heartbreaking gratitude. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a release, a farewell, a final acceptance of the path he had chosen for them both. Then she turned her back on the car, on the ghost, on the life that couldn't be, and walked down the steps. She did not look back. She walked toward the setting sun, her shadow long behind her, each step sure and steady, carrying with her the quiet strength he had shown her she possessed. The town car remained motionless for a long time, a dark slash against the vibrant twilight, before it finally, silently, pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the encroaching night, leaving her to the light. He had given her back her life, and in doing so, she had given him back a reason to have a soul. Theirs was not a story that would end in an embrace, but in the quiet, aching beauty of two worlds that touched for a moment, and then, for the sake of survival, pulled apart forever. His redemption was not in being with her, but in his choice to let her go, to remain her silent protector from a distance she would never have to cross again.
If this story of sacrifice and the impossible humanity found in the darkest of places resonated with you, let it be a reminder that some bonds are forged not in presence, but in absence. Please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more stories that dare to find light in the shadows. Tell us in the comments what you believe was sealed in that final, silent goodbye.